Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We'll give a couple of minutes for everyone to join in and get settled. And meanwhile, my name is Mal Schwartz. I'll be the MC for today's webinar, and I'm the founder of Shelters United. I'm also glad you decided to join us today. Today we're presenting the webinar, Access to a Veterinarian of Record, the Vet and Rescue Relationship, presented by Shelters United in collaboration with the University of Florida Shelter Medicine Distance Education Program. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question pane in your GoToWebinar control panel. We requested questions from participants prior to the webinar in advance, and if we can get through some of those, we'll do our best to answer a few more. And if you have a question that we can't answer due to time, one of our panelists will follow up with you after the webinar with a response. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our awesome panelists today, beginning with Dr. Terry Spencer, who serves as the Program Director for the University of Florida online graduate program in shelter medicine. She advises students who are pursuing an MS concentration in shelter medicine, supervises capstone project research and presentations, and coordinates faculty who are developing new courses and teaching online. She brings a unique background in both science education and veterinary medicine to the program. Dr. Amy Dalrymple has been part of the University of Florida Shelter Medicine instructional team since 2015. She earned her Master of Science degree in Shelter Medicine in 2018 with a capstone project focused on a case of an alleged rescue hoarding. Dr. Dalrymple is a practicing shelter veterinarian in the Boston area, and she enjoys the variety and challenges of working in this unique field. Julie Bank is a shelter consultant with Shelters United. She is also the principal of Jade Bank Consulting, where she works with nonprofit and government clients on operations, programming, and administration. She has worked for over 30 years in private, nonprofit, and animal welfare and governmental animal controls. And Julie will also be our timekeeper today, so you may hear her chime in from time to time to keep us moving and on time. Thanks for that, Julie. And Sarah Green is a University of Florida graduate student and will be graduating this December with a Master of Science in Veterinary Medical Sciences with a concentration in shelter medicine. She has worked in the animal welfare field for 2 decades in both nonprofit and municipal organizations. She has spent most of the last 10 years as the director of the Jeffersonville Animal Shelter. Dr. Marie Gagnon, who is having some camera issues, so you may not see her today, but you'll hear from her. She graduated from the University of Montreal Veterinary School in 1993 and almost immediately went into small animal practice ownership. 20 years later, after selling her practice, she became involved in animal welfare, high quality, high volume spay neuter, and shelter medicine. She has been involved in a large TNR organization for many years, was part of starting 2 high quality, high volume spay neuter programs in rural Kentucky, and is part of the professional team at 2 shelters while also working in the ER part-time. That's quite a responsibility. And I'm Mal, and I love what I do, helping make the world better for homeless pets. I'm the president of INPEX, the Institute for Nonprofit Excellence, and the founder of Shelters United. In creating the Shelters United GPO, my goal was to stretch the budgets of shelters and rescues nationwide so they can care for more animals. The mission has always been to help nonprofit, animal shelters, rescue groups, government organizations save money by sourcing manufacturer and distributor discounts on products needed to heal, protect, and adopt out healthy pets. Well, now on to today's agenda. We'll be hearing an overview of the current issues facing the veterinary world and animal welfare world in working together. Next, we'll hear about a new research project intended to bring animal welfare groups and vets of record together from the University of Florida online program in shelter medicine. And following that, we'll be hearing about the benefits and challenges of vet of record relationships from both a veterinary perspective and an animal welfare perspective. And lastly, we'll answer questions that were submitted from our webinar registrants. Now I'm passing this on to Julie for an introduction of the issues of veterinary in the veterinary world and the animal shelter world in working together. And thank you, Julie.
Well, thank you, Mal, for helping us put together this very important conversation. As Mal mentioned, Shelters United has a group purchasing organization. And as part of having a group purchasing organization, you need a vet of record to be able to purchase pharmaceuticals. So can you go to the next slide, please? We have heard from many of our clients that it's been very difficult and that the landscape out there in relation to having a veterinarian of record is really difficult. And you could see here a list of things that we have heard from Shelters United partners. You'll see that it's difficult purchasing pharmaceutical items. They're having difficulty finding exams and treatments for animals with medical injuries and also just basic treatments needed. Basic wellness, including rabies vaccines, spay, neuter, and surgery, euthanasia, certifications and drug logs, premise permits, everything on this list are all things that many of the animal sheltering folks are struggling finding veterinary support. Go to the next slide, please. So we wanted to try to help. And we wanted to try to really look at this issue deeply, which is why we started partnering with the University of Florida, which we'll hear about in a second. But our big picture is that veterinary care has been increasingly challenging for the animal welfare community. And part of that is because community is underserved. Part of that is because of the shortage of veterinarians. And some of them, it's just financial constraints. So we wanted to try to create a new program to focus on this problem, and we're calling it the Veterinarian of Record Initiative. If you can go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight what our ultimate goals are for this particular training and for the development of the program. So we want to develop a program that's going to help you. And that, when I say you, I'm meaning both the animal welfare organization as well as the participating veterinarian. We're looking at creating a state-by-state database of community veterinarians that are willing to serve as vet of records. We're looking to match shelters with veterinarians, but we also recognize that we have to develop materials and training to make sure that this relationship works. So we're looking at how-to guides, policies and procedures, pricing structures, MOUs, lists of approved supplies that could be ordered, and more that comes out of input from all of you guys. We're looking at potentially incorporating telemedicine into this new initiative and really having a good academic background and basis for all the things that we're working on to make sure that everybody is comfortable. We have a couple of stages. Right now, we're in the first stage of development of this program, and it's really about gauging interest and getting input about opportunities and challenges. We've connected with the University of Florida Shelter Medicine Program, which you'll hear about in a few minutes, to publish a research study that's going to get input from the community. And once we gather all of that information, we're going to get to work with the development of the things I mentioned earlier. And hopefully we'll be able to roll this out as a pilot test in some of your communities. And then once we really figure out that this is, that we have the magical solution, we're going to roll it out nationwide. So we're really excited about the opportunity of bringing this new initiative to you and really meeting a need in the animal welfare community that right now causes a lot of struggle for a lot of you. So my job today was really to just set up the stage for what we're going to be talking about today, and to let you know that we have a lot of future plans to bring you something that we really believe are going to be useful and pretty amazing. So with that, I am going to turn this over to Dr. Terry Spencer to give us a good overview of those next steps.
Dr. Spencer, I gave you the presenter, and I am seeing your screen. All right, go ahead, Dr. Spencer.
Okay, so we are here to talk a little bit about the research that the University of Florida graduate program in shelter medicine is going to be doing. It should be kicking off here soon. It's a research project that our students and faculty members will be gathering information about veterinary of record relationships. But before I describe to you what will be in the survey that we're going to send out to you, I want to give you some context for why we think it's important to really dig into this relationship. So we all know something about relationships, and we know that if there's two people in a relationship, that's the simplest form of relationship, but even that is not simple. In our lifetime, we've probably all been in very rewarding interpersonal relationships, but some are kind of problematic and others can be even very traumatic. And it takes a lot of work to keep these relationships going, to create them and to maintain them. So in the academic world where I live, there are lots of disciplines that study relationships. So all over campus, you'll find psychology, sociology, anthropology, business management, and marketing people studying these simple relationships and trying to figure out what causes them to break. But there's whole industries that have arisen to support relationships. Some of you may have hired life coaches in the past. That's a brand new industry out there to help with interpersonal relationships and professional relationships. But when you start adding more people into a relationship, every new person adds a layer of complexity to the situation. A very good example of a very complex relationship is what happens inside an animal shelter or a rescue group. There's an executive director who has to speak with board members and maybe politically elected county commissioners, as well as staff and adopters and volunteers and fosters and community members. And so every person has input and has to be communicated with. It's very complex. There are professional groups that help to guide these complex relationships for shelters. For instance, what we do at the University of Florida, we work on trying to give everybody baseline knowledge about shelter medicine so that they know what the guidelines are for practicing and how to adhere to best practices. But there's many other groups out there. There's ASPCA, the Humane Society of the United States, Maddie's Fund, all kinds of places to help guide these relationships. But today we're talking about adding one more layer into that complex shelter relationship already. And that's when you add a professional layer onto it with a veterinarian. And veterinary relationships are more complex even because once you get a vet involved, you also have oversight from regulatory boards that can be both at the state and the federal level. For instance, a veterinarian has to answer to their state board of veterinary medicine and maintain what's called a veterinary client relationship. And Dr. Dalrymple, who's going to follow me, will tell you more about that relationship. But the vets are also overseen by the federal DEA agencies for their use of drugs. And there are places that we as shelter vets go to learn more about those professional relationships. And we have, from the Association of Shelter Veterinarians, we have guidelines for standards of care in animal shelters, which guides us for what are all the best practices and protocols that we should be implementing. So I'm going to move on because we're going to talk in this research project about one specific complex relationship. And that specific complex relationship is a business relationship, as Julie mentioned to you, and it's a three-way relationship. It's the very complex shelter with a professional veterinarian who is regulated. In the middle is the supply wholesaler from the veterinary supplier. And so this relationship is mandated by the wholesaler so that the shelter can order the drugs and equipment that they need, okay? So the veterinarian has to put their license up for that to happen. So what's interesting is that we don't have a definition or guidelines in the shelter medicine world for what this vet of record relationship should look like. There are other specialties in veterinary medicine, such as the Association of Bovine Practitioners, which they handle dairies and beef cattle, those kinds of operations. But they have very specific guidelines that look like this, that have been in practice, and it details in a couple of pages what the veterinary of record relationship should look like. and it's embedded within the veterinary client-patient relationship that vets have to follow by their state boards and their license. So it has a written agreement, oversight agreement, relationships with consultants and other vets, treatment protocols, and you'll see it says right on the first page, have a veterinarian of record. So it's very much defined. And you might ask, well, why isn't shelter medicine defined if other practices are defined? That's because bovine practitioners have been around for 100 years or more, as a specialty, and shelter medicine's only been around for about a decade or more. So it's coming, but when the guidelines are published, they'll probably look something like the bovine guidelines, and Dr. Dalrymple will go into this in more detail. But it's because bovine practitioners operate or work very much like shelter medicine practitioners. We treat both individual animals, but we also treat the whole herd. So we call that population medicine. So what we need to start developing these guidelines is to answer a bunch of basic questions. And so our survey is going to send out a bunch of basic questions. So the problem is that we want to know what these relationships, what makes them productive and what causes them to break down. What are the challenges, and start to develop these guidelines that we need. Our hypothesis is that we think good relationships out there already exist, and you're going to hear one of those later with Sarah and Dr. Gagnon. But we want to find out where those good relationships are so that we can capture what's good and replicate it across the country. Additionally, we suspect one of the reasons that veterinarians are not very willing to serve as a veterinary of record is that there's multiple reasons. They're already too busy, or they can't afford to discount any further, or they can't do any more pro bono work, or they've had bad experiences in relationships in the past, or they don't have authority to oversee how their license is being used. So we're developing a survey with some basic questions in it. And if I can find my cursor, there are things like, do you currently have a relationship with a vet of record, and why or why not? Or are you satisfied with that relationship, and why or why not? What are your concerns about creating new or maintaining existing vet of record relationships? What are the pain points in those relationships? Because we know they can be problems. And why do veterinary of record relationships sometimes end? What causes them to end? And what additional tools or technologies do people need to support these relationships? So this survey is actually at the Institutional Research Board right now that has to approve before we can send out that survey. And I expect the survey to get into people's hands by after Thanksgiving or early December. And Shelters United will be sending out the survey for us to all of their members, but you may get it from other professional organizations as well. It'll go to both veterinarians and to shelters, and the vets don't have to be shelter vets, they can be private practice vets, okay? But I want to prep you for a couple of the questions that will be in the survey. So we want to hear you, so we want to see what's working and what you need help with. But we also will be collecting samples of MOUs and contracts that you might have used in the past. So you don't have to give us any names in the contract, but if you're willing to share those, there'll be a place in the survey where you can upload them. And you can tell us what worked in those contracts or what didn't, okay? That would be super helpful. The other thing is that it's anonymous. The survey itself is anonymous because we don't want to associate anybody with if they've had a bad time with something or whatever. But there will be a final question where you can opt in and give us your name and contact information in case you want to be part of one of the pilot projects or a telemedicine project or something like Julie described that Shelters United may build after we get this research. So just to assure you though that last question is separated from your answer in the survey. It will never be tied to your name, okay? And the final piece is that we'll also be asking you about which particular protocols would be most helpful to you for a vet of record to assist your shelter and rescue with from the beginning. And partly that's because we think a lot of shelters aren't familiar with all the other things that a shelter veterinarian can do besides spay neuter. And so we're very much trained in infectious disease control and in population management. And so if you're going to have a vet of record, let's see what else we can get them to do, okay? So with that, I have my contact information here. You can reach out to me, or you can reach out to Shelters United and they can get a hold of me. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Dalrymple.
All right.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, and I'll be following up with some diving deeper into some of the things that Dr. Spencer mentioned. In my introduction, it was shared that I am an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Florida, but I also work for various shelters and rescues in the Boston area. The first half of my career was actually in private practice, and I was invited to start working for a rescue organization several years ago, and they introduced me to the Association of Shelter Veterinarians, and so I converted all the way over to shelter medicine. So next slide, please. So first I want to speak about the rewards of serving as a vet of record, particularly for the veterinarians who are tuning in. This picture I chose to just remind me of the experience that happens when everyone's working together as a team, taking care of animals in a rescue or a small shelter. For example, I started working with a small feline shelter. They'd previously just been a foster network, and although they maintained their foster network, they wanted to have a central facility. So I was working as their vet of record at that central place. And I explained to them that we would need to organize things differently. They wouldn't be going to different appointments all the time. We would be bringing them in centrally while I was there, and I had volunteers and the shelter manager working with me, and we were able to take care of in-house appointments. So for example, we had several foster kittens this summer. So we had them on following a protocol that I set up to get their vaccines, their dewormers, and everything at the appropriate age. And we set up those appointments at the shelter, and they came in to see me, and I was helped by the staff there, and it worked really well. And at the end of one of those appointments, you know, they were commenting, wow, that was really satisfying. I'm like, yeah, it's really fun. You know, you set it up and it works really well. So that's the feeling I wish for all vets working with shelters and rescues, because it's a good experience. Next slide, please. So here's a list of some of the things that are rewards of serving as a vet of record. So promoting good animal welfare. I mentioned getting the treatments and vaccines at the appropriate time. So it's sometimes really difficult if you have to go to see outside vets or appointments are hard to get. So this way, you know, all of these kittens were getting everything right when they were supposed to. You're providing effective and efficient medical care, so you're saving time for everyone, the veterinarian and the rescue, because, you know, even though volunteers can give a lot of time, it's still a really important resource, and you conserve it just as you do with money. It decreased costs for the nonprofit organization, obviously, because as the vet of record, they can order the supplies and drugs at a much reduced cost. A veterinarian can take care of more animals in less amount of time, so it's more efficient and a lower cost that way. I like working with shelters and rescues because you're working with compassionate people. They're just really cool. So it's fun that way. And part of the life-saving community, because I work contract and relief, I sometimes get to watch follow an animal might get transferred to another organization and then into its adoptive home, and it's very satisfying to see everybody work together to make that happen. Another thing is if you're a private practitioner, you might gain clients post-adoption, because the rescues that I work with usually would advertise what veterinarian they worked with, and that's another fun thing to do, is to take care of an animal before adoption and after with their new home. So next slide, please. So along with the rewards, though, there are certainly challenges. So these are the things that I'm going to go over. The legal and ethical compliance components for veterinarians. That's the veterinarian client-patient relationship, VCPR. Communication, logistics, responsibilities of both the veterinarian and the organization need to be defined, and payment. So we will dive into each of these topics. Next slide, please. So VOR and VCPR, we got our acronyms here. So as Dr. Spencer mentioned, our colleagues in large animal medicine have defined the veterinarian of record pretty completely. I chose to take this paragraph from the document put out by the American Association of Small Ruminant Practitioners. Small ruminants are sheep and goats. And it does follow along with the bovine practitioners document as well. But I substituted the word shelter for farm, and I'm just going to read it to you so to understand how this relationship would work for small animals. So veterinarian of record, the veterinarian of record takes responsibility for making medical judgments on in the shelter regarding the health and welfare of animals, and is the responsible party for providing appropriate oversight of drug use in the shelter. Such oversight is critical in establishing and maintaining a VCPR, that's the veterinarian client-patient relationship. This oversight should include establishment of treatment protocols, training of personnel, review of treatment records, monitoring use of all drugs, regardless of where or from whom the drugs are distributed. So that's if you're using over-the-counter or you're getting drugs from other places prescribed by their vets. Your vet of record will be overseeing that as well. Next slide, please. So why is it important? So the veterinarian client-patient relationship is the legal and ethical foundation of veterinary practice. Many state veterinary practice acts include that language, and if it's not in the Practice Act, it's often part of the board policies. The federal regulations will apply in certain instances. One is if any drugs approved for human use are used in animals. It's for any extra label use of animal drugs, which means that the drug was approved for use in one species and you're using it in a different species. And it's also required for compounded drugs. So that happens all the time in veterinary practice. So the federal regulation is important, and I'll mention where that comes in. The AVMA principles of veterinary medical ethics is founded on the veterinary client-patient relationship as well. Next slide, please. So it's a relationship, as Dr. Spencer said. And so there are a person and an organization. So in the shelter situation, the organization is the client. So the veterinarian has a responsibility for providing quality care. They need to have sufficient and recent knowledge of the conditions and the species that they're treating, and they should be providing information and education to their client. The client needs to have confidence in the veterinary advice and agreement to follow the advice. There needs to be trust in this relationship. The veterinarian needs to trust that the client's going to follow their directions. The client needs to trust that the veterinarian is giving them the best information possible. And both need to have effective communication and conversation. So this can be, for example, even when I'm in private practice and talking with a client, it's totally appropriate for the client to bring up difficulties in if they don't have the resources or the ability to do what I'm asking them to do. It's certainly okay to say that's not within my budget, or I don't think I'm going to be able to give a drug 3 times a day. Is there another option? And so these are the kinds of conversations that you have within a functioning relationship. Next slide, please. So establishing VCPR. So this establishing your veterinarian client-patient relationship when a veterinarian is working with a shelter for the first time, or any client, actually. This is, we're just in this situation, we're talking about an organization. It varies by state. I've put a little map here showing one situation where in the State Practice Act, it states that the veterinarian must have examined or physically examined the animal. So that means in person. And so you can see all the green states, there's several of them. This website at the bottom is promoting telemedicine and veterinary medicine. And so it's a useful resource if you want to see more maps. Federal, again, applies to extra label and compounded drugs. The federal VCPR needs to be established either in person, at least either by physical examination of the animal or familiarity with the premises. It cannot be established remotely. So those in-person requirements are often challenging. It can, in some cases, be established by the clinical judgment of the veterinarian. The DVM is Doctor of Veterinary Medicine. With the COVID pandemic, there was a waiver of some of these VCPR requirements in some states, and it's hoping that some of them might stay in place, but some have reverted back. So it's really a situation where you need to check in with your state requirements. The VCPR may be shared by vets within a practice. So if there is a hospital that you go to or you bring your pets to, and one of those vets is a vet of record for you, and if they have a VCPR with you, then all of the vets that they work with have that relationship as well. But that's, again, something that's in your state Veterinary Practice Act. Next slide, please. So communication. So now I'm going to go into the tips for having a successful relationship. For communication, I'd strongly recommend one point of contact for the organization, one person who communicates with the vet regularly. You can have a backup person as well, in case, whenever that person's away or not able to do it. That one person needs to have the authority to make decisions. Just as it's challenging to see a pet in private practice when the person who brings in the pet doesn't know what's going on or needs to check in with multiple family members, it really delays care and takes a lot of time. Written protocols and procedures, make sure that everybody understands what their job is and how it should be done, and keeps everything flowing and good. Make sure all the animals receive the care that they need when they need it. And the mode of communication should be established. So, we're talking about email, cell phone, maybe your organization uses Slack, and also determine what hours it's appropriate to call your veterinarian. I did work with a colleague, another veterinary colleague, who really preferred to speak on the phone versus email. I had an organization that used Slack for a lot of things, but it was constant. And so they asked if I wanted to be on the Slack channel. And I said no, because I wasn't going to be able to field that all of the time. So it should also establish how early you can call the vet or how late, and what you should do in emergency situations. Next slide, please. Logistics. So the other thing to iron out is how often your vet's going to go there. So I've usually, when I've worked as a contract veterinarian, gone on a weekly basis. That's because of the requirements in my state. There are a lot of regulations that require weekly exams at offsite adoption centers. So it's made sense for me, and I feel comfortable with that schedule. But it would be, as far as maintaining the relationship, you'd work that out with your own veterinarian. I do recommend routine rounds. So rounds is something that we talk about where you go through and visit every animal in the shelter and make sure they're getting what they need efficiently. And we talk about that in the traditional shelter, but you can still do it with a rescue, either in person at the weekly visit, or you could even do it virtually with fosters. And that's a good way to make sure things don't fall through the cracks. The veterinarian should oversee all protocols and procedures that relate to animal health and welfare. So that includes things like population management and sanitation, as Dr. Spencer mentioned. And the organization should have everything prepared and organized to maximize efficiency for the veterinarian's visit. So if I'm coming at a certain time, expect the volunteers to be there, everything's set up, all the tests and treatments and things ready to go. Otherwise, you'll be spending money on time that's not being used efficiently. Next slide, please. Responsibilities. So make sure that it's clear of what the responsibilities of the veterinarian is, the responsibilities of the organization. Written contract or memorandum of understanding, also called an MOU, is very helpful and highly recommended. That should also include the consequences of not following through. For example, let's say you want your contract vet to promote compliance with your state regulations, but then your organization's director is not doing that. So that's a reason for me that a relationship has ended, because the organization is not complying with the very regulations that they hired me to ask them to do. Next slide. And payment.
Dr. Dalrymple, you have about 2 minutes left. So
all right, thank you. The payment should be part of the written agreement. Organizations I've worked for often prefer a flat fee versus an hourly charge. It allows them to plan their budget accordingly if it is a regular charge. So there might be a minimum charge depending on how far the veterinarian travels to you. For example, I will reserve a half day for an organization to commute a fair distance, and then that's the minimum charge, is they pay for a half day. Even if I get there and there's only an hour's worth of work to do, you're still paying for a half day. Some vets charge travel time, so you just figure out how that's going to be. Method of payment is important, and how often, if it's monthly or biweekly or whatever that's going to be, and pay them promptly. It's not okay to just not pay your vet for months because you don't have the budget for it. Next slide, please. All right, so a few resources here if you want to hear all about VCPR and see diagrams and all the different unique situations that shelters encounter. There is a webinar that I did for the Association for Animal Welfare Advancement. It is free, you just have to register for their learning center to watch it. There's an article here about recruiting, developing, and supporting shelter vets that can be helpful. And then, of course, our online shelter medicine program. Thank you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Green and Dr. Marie Gagnon to talk about their positive experience.
Hello, thank you all for having me. My name is Sarah Green, and I'm the director of the Jeffersonville Animal Shelter. Just to give you a picture of the size of our shelter, and we are a managed intake shelter serving Clark County, Indiana, which is a population of about 123,000. We have 13 employees, 5 of those are part-time for approximately 2,500 intakes per year, when including TNR and RTF cats and our intake members. Before our current vet of record, which I'll get to momentarily, we had a similar relationship with another vet for about a decade, with Dr. Lisa Powell, and she performed spay and neuters for us on her day off from her full-time job at her private clinic. And during that relationship, not only was she the vet of record on our pharmaceutical and vet supply accounts, but we were also under her DEA for controlled substances. We had a great arrangement because she had long-term clients that were sometimes looking to add to their family, and she knew our animals and would help us get our animals adopted to them. Also, it was beneficial to her because she, her name was on the rabies certificates and the medical documents, so a lot of times she would gain a client from our adopters. When we entered the relationship with Dr. Gagnon a few years ago, the shelter got its own limited license for controlled substances, and she is the VOR on our accounts with Patterson, Midwest, Zoetis. So as with Dr. Powell, she is not considered an employee or a city employee. She rather bills us monthly for services provided. Next slide, please. So we call Dr. Gagnon our unicorn vet because people with her experience, skill, and compassion can sometimes be difficult to find. She comes to the shelter 1 day a week to perform spay and neuters, rabies vaccinations, and health certs for our out-of-state transports. She typically performs 25 to 35 surgeries a day. This is done with me as the sole assistant, so we have a lot of ground to cover on surgery days. She'll also perform enucleations, tail amputations, wound care, heartworm treatment on our adoptable heartworm positive dogs. She'll advise us on medical cases as needed, but has given us protocols to follow on frequent issues such as kennel cough or URIs in cats. We try to send all of our extra TNR, RTF cats and at least a couple of dogs a week to high volume clinics, just to try to keep up with a long list of surgeries and shorten the length of stay of our animals, since we only have her 1 day a week. It's almost impossible to keep up with the list of surgeries that need to be done. We're very fortunate that she is very shelter medicine minded, and has worked many years providing high quality, high volume spay neuter to several shelters. So she's able to get lots done in a short amount of time. Next slide, please. So I think the reason our relationship works so well is because we have mutual trust. We understand expectations of each other. I respect her time. I try not to bother her unless absolutely necessary. I don't cross boundaries. And when I do have to contact her, I try to do so via text and have as much information about the situation as I can, pictures, videos, background information, just to cut down on the time of hers that I'm taking. If something comes up that is outside of our medical protocols, I will always consult her before doing anything, and I know she knows that. I always respect her medical opinion, and I think this is very important because while that seems obvious, I think sometimes it's not taken into consideration with shelter staff at sometimes. So I always respect her decisions. And we obviously have limited resources, so there are things that, you know, we aren't going to be able to do, but she understands that. We talk about different options for treatment, and we try to land on something that we both agree on that is attainable for us as a shelter. The obvious benefits are having the ability to order our much needed vaccines and medications for the shelter, and being able to provide care for our animals and see them through common ailments through her guidance. You know, this allows us to save more animals and provide healthier animals for adoption to our community. Also, being able to perform spay and neuters and treat heartworm positive dogs in-house is not only convenient for us, you know, especially given the small size of the staff we have, but also is less stressful for our animals, which is great for everybody. And it saves an incalculable amount of time and money. With our heartworm positives, it's literally a lifesaver. I remember a decade ago, if we had a heartworm positive dog and we could not find rescue to take that on, then that dog was likely euthanized as an outcome. Now, you know, we have a protocol for that. We can go ahead and put the dog on the adoption floor and be working, you know, on getting it in the doctor and get it into a home, and then it comes back on the days that she's there to finish out the heartworm protocol. So this is a much better situation for the dogs than sitting in the kennel waiting for treatment. So also this has changed our managed intake a little bit. So I know that I can count on her to do a certain amount of surgeries, and she can usually fit a few more in. So if someone calls the day before surgery and says, I've got 4 8-week-old kittens, need to get them in there, I can't take care of them anymore. You know, usually our managed intake, we're backed up to 2 to 4 weeks. But I can go ahead and take those in because I know tomorrow's surgery day. We can fit them in, we can get them on the adoption floor, they'll be adopted by the end of the week. So it's just really nice to be able to help our community like that. And then also in those instances, we have the ability to quickly get to the people and talk about fixing mom and things like that as well. So having a good relationship with a great VOR is honestly one of the biggest reasons that we're able to save as many animals and help as many animals as we do in our community. It is definitely not something to be taken for granted. And with that, I will give that to Dr. Gagnon.
Well, Sarah has done a really good job about talking about our relationship and how we do things at that particular shelter. I think that we see some issues with shelters having finding a vet of record, and there's many different, like, that's what we've been talking. There's many different reasons for that. But I think one really good reason, like Sarah said, is like the veterinarian's opinion should be respected. Things can be discussed together and come up to a good outcome. I'm a member of a few Facebook groups where shelter veterinarians, we kind of talk to each other about situations. And it's sad sometimes for me to hear about shelter managers that treat the veterinarian as just somebody that can do spay and neuter and not anything else, and not be involved into deciding protocol or discussing cases. So I think that it's a two-way street, and when you can find somebody that is shelter minded, that's willing to do a little bit of back and forth as far as communication, then you can find a great veterinarian and keep them, just treating them well. And that's what I have to say. And I think we're Mal.
Thank you
Mal, would
so
you like
much,
to-
Sarah and Dr. Gagnon. I really loved hearing how you both work together. And I also want to thank our various speakers for sharing their time and their knowledge today. And now it's time for some answers to some questions. We asked our webinar, we invite all of our panelists to turn their cameras and their microphones back on. We asked our webinar registrants questions ahead of time, and if we have time left, we'll try to get do our best to answer the questions that you've asked during the webinar. We may be able to run a few minutes late if people want to stay, and otherwise we'll reach out to you with some answers as we go. So first question is for Dr. Spencer. What is the best approach to recruiting veterinarians familiar with shelter medicine?
So that's a really good question. It's tough to recruit any veterinarian across the universe right now. But if you're looking for someone with shelter medicine training, the good news is in the last decade, most veterinary schools in the US are starting to teach shelter medicine. And I would say almost every one of them teaches shelter medicine. But the caveat is that it's really a way to get surgical experience for students or to learn some like basic medicine, like how to sew up a wound or those kinds of things. So it's really not what we've been talking about tonight in terms of all the other protocols and guidelines. So you might want to build relationships with certain schools that you know are really teaching a more broad shelter medicine background and reach out to those new grads. So as you know, UF is up there, but there's other ones too, like Cornell and Tufts and maybe University of Wisconsin and different places. So kind of poke around and see what they're teaching about shelter medicine. But any veterinarian can be the veterinary of record. They don't have to have a shelter medicine background. So if you recruit someone who's really interested in working at the shelter, do what Dr. Dalrymple might have mentioned, that encourage them to join the Association of Shelter Veterinarians or seek some continuing education in shelter medicine. We're a very small, very vocal, very friendly group, and we will help any veterinarians along the way. So I think that would be really helpful. But you could also, ask for someone or send them for additional training. So if they become an employee for you, you might give them CE benefits and make sure that they attend an ASPCA conference or a Best Friends national meeting or something. Okay.
Terrific, thank you. Julie, next question is for you. What's the best way for small rescues and small shelters who don't have the budget to hire a full-time veterinarian?
Well, as you said in the question, it does take money to be able to hire a veterinarian, and Dr. Dalrymple reminded us that we have to pay our bills and we have to make sure that we are treating their time and energy with respect. This is a great area for you to consider donations and consider grants. There are definitely some grants out there and some people who really feel that shelter medicine or just medicine in general or helping animals in medical straits is something that they want to support. So I would definitely create some sort of an opportunity to bring in funds based on that. You can use individual animals needs if you have an individual animal with a great story, and also do a lot of research there. But the sad reality of it is, having the ability to provide medical care is important to our work. And if we can't, then we have to really look at that as part of our strategic planning and decide whether we can actually take in the amount of animals that we have been taking in and whether we should and how that's impacting the quality of care. So all of these, though, hopefully will be answered and we'll give you some strategies when we develop a new program.
Question for Dr. Dalrymple. I'd love more information about VCPRs and how to effectively and legally support shelters as a veterinarian, asking the question.
Okay, so the VCPR, the first place you need to start is to check your state's practice acts and policies, because that will really help you determine how you would legally comply. In my state, I'm in Massachusetts, it's quite strict, so the VCPR does have to be established in person. So I have to examine each animal that I prescribe for. So I have found that a weekly arrangement works really nicely, like to visit the shelter every week. That doesn't mean that I don't talk to them in between those days. I can do that too, or arrange for an extra time if there's a particularly large transport coming in or something like that. The advent of telehealth really could be helpful in maintaining these relationships. You can maintain, like once you establish the VCPR, you can maintain it virtually. There's a wonderful booklet by the AVMA that talks about the various types of telehealth and telemedicine and what governs that. That can be helpful if a shelter is farther away from you or you've limited access. It is possible in some locations that you may be able to establish VCPR by remote means, but you would have to check with your Veterinary Practice Act as far as that goes. And again, there's that webinar from AWA that kind of covers a lot of the unique situations we run into, like health certificates and such.
Next question is for Sarah and Dr. Gagnon. We are having a problem finding veterinarians that work with injured and sick stray and feral cats, which is 80% of our work.
I'm not sure if you're in a rural or urban area, and I know sometimes that can change the landscape on access to vets. But if you did have a VOR, but they don't perform other services at the shelter, I would speak to them maybe about creating protocols on how to deal with the smaller issues under their guidance that they might feel comfortable with. If they could sit down with you and agree on these protocols, I think that could go a long way. If you don't have a VOR and have to transport to a vet for every service, I would ask to maybe meet with the vets that you may think are open to treating. They may not necessarily want to deal with us at their clinic and have ill strays with their own clients, but you might be able to do something like contract with them to come to your shelter for a couple of hours a week to deal with those kind of things. Also, there's HSUS and Best Friends. That a lot of them have state or regional reps that could probably give you some good guidance on vets in your area that might be able to help, and maybe they will help with introductions with that. Also, if you're near a vet school, I would definitely reach out to them as well.
And Dr. Gagnon, the question includes that the fact that sick, injured and sick stray and feral cats, is that the challenge of getting veterinarians to work with that population. Could you comment on that?
I definitely think that you're going to have to do some work as far as finding the right person through word of mouth. You know, you need to call veterinarian and talk to them. And typically, even in a pretty big city like Louisville, many of us know each other, and many of us would know who may be able to help. Maybe somebody is close to retirement. You know, I always say there's dog vet and cat vet too. So just finding somebody that cares more about cat in general than maybe a typical small animal practitioner, and then also that it provide them the information or the ability to get the information about how to work with those community, you know, if not even to send them to one of those national seminar that they can attend, and they can get C hours, and they can also learn a lot about how to handle cats that are more aggressive, and how to deal with them as far as what's doable, what's not doable, what's right and what's not. So, but I think word of mouth is definitely a big way, and that's how me and Sarah got in contact, through word of mouth, and I think that it's just going to be the key to find the right person to help you, because that person is out there. I know a lot of veterinarians just here in Louisville that will do that. Years ago, we had a Sunday a month, we had 10 to 15 veterinarians volunteer their time to spay and neuter feral cats, and we did that for 15 or 16 years. So we found those veterinarians, they were there, and they were there to help. So they're out there. It's just look really good, and you'll find.
Well, that's very inspiring. Thank you. Question for Dr. Dalrymple. How do you balance multiple vets when you have a vet of record?
So if the veterinarians are in the same practice, like I mentioned before, they can share VCPR. If you're talking about veterinarians within different practices, the answer is you have a separate relationship with every veterinarian, which I've worked very effectively in arrangements that involve 2 or even 3 veterinarians quite a few times, where one of us was the vet of record, but we collaborated and had similar practice styles and knew each other personally, so that worked out well. Most of the time it was the vet of record was somebody who had their own hospital but didn't have the time to go to the premises. Well, I would go to the premises, but if the animal needed more services or things like that, then we would confer on cases. However, in recent years, I have observed in my area that access is so difficult right now that some rescues are going to many, many vets, like they're getting an appointment wherever they can. And the more vets you involve, the more complicated it gets. And if the animal has like quite a few medical problems, it's not just for spay or neuter, it's for, maybe an echocardiogram or x-rays or something. You get more than a few vets involved, and if we don't know each other and we don't practice the same way, it can be a big mess. So I recommend, if you're going to get a vet of record, that you focus on that one person. I've served as a vet of record. I put my organization in charge with someone that I knew who did pediatric spay neuter. They were having trouble getting spay neuter. We set up something really nice, and that's because of my personal relationship. So I would concur with the word of mouth that Dr. Gagnon mentioned. That's pretty much how I've gotten all my jobs.
Well, that is so helpful. We're going to return for questions and answers in just a moment, but I just want to share for those who may never have heard about Shelters United before or don't know what we do. We help over 1,500 animal welfare groups save money so that they can save more lives. Shelters United is the only group purchasing organization specifically for nonprofit animal welfare orgs and animal welfare municipal orgs. We're passionate about helping you keep as much of your hard-earned fundraising dollars as possible to help save more lives. We work with manufacturers to obtain discounts on thousands of products that you already use and purchase every day. And with these discounts, our members have saved over $2 million in 2021 alone. Remember that when retail pricing goes to online retailers like Amazon or Chewy, you get no discount. When you work with us, you get access to 50,000 products with 22 warehouses across the country offering same day or next day shipping and tons of everyday low prices. On top of everyday savings, when you join Shelters United, you get access to special offers and discounts that you just can't get anyplace else. We're always negotiating offers to help animal welfare groups like yours, and you won't want to miss them. So be sure to check your email from Shelters United. Our team is always sourcing new partnerships to increase our group's buying power for deeper discounts and on new products. And when you join Shelters United, you'll get a dedicated member consultant who's like your personal shopper. We're always on the case with new discounts to save you money so you can save more lives. There is a slide coming up next that will give you some information if you want to learn more. We have a few ways to get and stay in touch. The best way is to fill out the exit survey if you leave this webinar. You can also email us at info@sheltersunited.com or visit our website at sheltersunited.com. And as a very important call to action, remember to keep your eyes open on your email inbox to participate in the University of Florida research project that Dr. Spencer discussed today. We would love to hear about your feedback, love to hear your experiences, your pain points, so that we can all develop a program that will help match animal welfare groups with veterinarians of record and save even more lives together. So thank you for your time and all the work that you do. Please remember to fill out the exit survey. Thanks for joining today. And for those who can remain on the line, Julie, perhaps you have another question that has come in to the chat today that you might want to ask.
I do. Thank you, Mal. This first question is just a clarification for Dr. Dalrymple in your presentation. They were referring to one of your visuals and they were asking whether the blue states required an exam or the white states required the
That one was, it was like a blue-green color. Those were the ones that required an exam, but there were different permutations. So it really, it's best to check your State Practice Act directly.
Okay, thank you. There is also a question from somebody who is a veterinarian but new to shelter medicine, but they want to help and they want to know what is the best way to negotiate prices. And I think if it's okay if I answer that, I think that is one of the things that we're going to look at in the development of this program, to be able to give you just some suggestions. Obviously, that has to be different depending on your community, but to give you some suggestions on that and on contracts to make it on the up and up and comfortable for everybody. Go ahead.
Julie, I would say too that in the survey, we'll be collecting information about what vets feel like per hour charges should be for certain things and what shelters think they're willing to pay per hour for things. So we're trying to collect that information as well. And no one ever likes to talk about money.
Go ahead.
I can share a little bit. I mean, there are some veterinarians who will donate their services. So if you're lucky to find that, that might be a possibility, or a private practitioner might discount services. So in my area, I see them discounted 10 to 20% for organizations, but you have to discuss that with the hospital itself. For me, working on contract basis, I charge per hour with a minimum charge, and the hourly charge I would use as your guideline. The relief that rates in your area, I charge the same as for private practice as I do for shelter. And the salary is for private practice vets. And in the latest survey, which there was an article a few years ago, that they're on par with private practice. But it depends on where you live. So don't be thinking that it's half price because you're doing shelter medicine.
I would also suggest to someone who wanted to jump in that remember it's your time that's the value. And so you should get paid for your time, but there are ways to creatively discount other things for the shelter. For instance, I've worked in shelters where rescues come to the shelter to use our services for things, but we would purchase drugs for them and have like a whole bottle of, or a whole case of Clavamox that's for that rescue. And so we would dispense from that rather than charge them an individual prescription charge each time. So they would have their own supply of certain drugs to save, but they would still pay for our time. So.
And there's also the Facebook group that I think is Shelter Medicine Veterinarian, and there's high quality, high volume spay neuter. There's a Shelter Medicine Relief group. So all these are available, and you know, on the day-to-day basis, when you get a question, you can ask just, you know, a bunch of people that are doing the same thing as you do for their advice. And for me, it's been very helpful.
And don't forget, you can always study online with us at the University of Florida. We're a nice, friendly group too.
There are a bunch of questions that are asking more about the logistics of some of this webinar and future. So what the question was, whether this is going to be available and will they get the slides. So the recording will be available and will be sent to you after the webinar is over. Which obviously you'll have access to those slides. There was also a bunch of questions about the development of the program and whether it will be regionally specific, including the list of vet of records that will be matched. So that is the hope. The hope is that we are going to get individuals that will sign up and say you are in need of a vet of record, or you are a veterinarian looking to become a vet of record, and we can match you there. I think there's just one final question in here, and the question was, could you repeat those Facebook groups that you just mentioned?
Me?
I think, I'm not sure who said the Facebook groups, but I think it was me.
So that's mainly for veterinarians. I mean, of course, there's a bunch for rescues and shelters, but for veterinarians, the Facebook groups are Shelter Medicine Veterinarian. That's the group, and then high quality, high volume spay neuter. There is Relief, high quality, high volume spay neuter, and then there's Relief Shelter Veterinarian group 2. So, and
Right. I think, Mal, that is the end of our questions.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank everybody so much for joining. It's really been delightful to know that you're interested in learning more. And please take our exit survey, and we look forward to continuing to work together to try to resolve this challenging situation of lack of the availability of veterinary care for our shelters and rescues. And it's something that we all, aspire to really get to a place where it's not quite so challenging as it is today. So we'll look forward to that day. Thank you very much. And thank you, panelists. This has been so awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Goodbye.